So we are now beginning chapter 9 in your U.S. history book, and we're going to be talking about the age of Thomas Jefferson, the age of Jeffersonian, politics. And we're going to go over how did Thomas Jefferson believe differently from the Federalists who were before him, talking about his politics, the customs, the different customs of that time, the Jeffersonian customs they call it, onto Jefferson's new policy and the Supreme Court. So here's a picture of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson takes office. So we went over that he won president. It was a tie between him and Aaron Burr, and he became president because Alexander Hamilton picked him. So, and as taking that, being that head of Congress, basically the Senate or the House of Representatives, I should say. So now we have the inaugural address on March 4th, 1801 of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the first president inaugurated in the new Capitol, in the White House. So he was the first president to have his inauguration there. Hallelujah. No. Anyway, the Capitol was unfinished though, and there was just a few boarding houses on the Potomac. But the Capitol, the White House, was finished, not quite finished, but at least for the president to live there. And this would start the quarter of a century of Republican control. Now the Federalists would never be in control again. It would be the Democrat Republic, which were under Jeffersonian politics. This would be mainly under Jefferson and Madison, because each would stay in the presidency for 2 terms. So we have that's 4 terms, so close to close to 25 years there, and on to Monroe too. So they would be all of the Republican. So the United States would double in size in this time, and you know why? The Louisiana Purchase. We're going to talk about that. The domestic affairs were strengthened during this time, and they fought a war to protect their rights in the high seas during this time. We did, and bought the respect of the nations abroad. And we'll find that under not only Jefferson, mainly under James Madison, who followed him as 4th president. Jeffersonian politics. I like this. It says, most bad government has grown out of too much government. So he really wants the states to have govern and not to have the central government have too much power. That's Thomas Jefferson. So, the power transferred to this other party, and it was a peaceful transfer into Thomas Jefferson. Even Alexander Hamilton supported him. The Jeffersonian era strongly was influenced by political thought in this course of history. So it's a different political thought. For one thing, he opposed the federal bank. Later on, we'll find that he decides not to oppose the federal bank, and we'll find out why. I'll give you a clue. Because of the Louisiana Purchase, he would need a bank, wouldn't he? But anyway, so he opposed the power of the federal government, having the power. We don't want the government to have very much power or control very much money, right? That was his thought. So he had a very loose construction of the Constitution. Let me say, he had a strict construction of the loose Constitution. Well, so basically, the Constitution he felt should be strict. And under the federal government, there was a loose construction of basically, the federal government could actually, put in what they wanted to do or stretch. They basically stretch the Constitution, the elastic clause. So anyway, the Federalists sought to win the Federalists and to the Republican cause. So basically he was saying, instead of alienating these Federalists, let's win them to our cause. So it was peaceful. He said, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. So basically he's saying, let's not have differences of opinion. So he wanted to get along with the Federalists, which were partly in control at that time. He basically said we're all Federalists and we're all Republicans. So He was wanting it to be a peaceful transfer. The loose construction of the Constitution, and he really had a strict construction. I don't know, that might be a mistake there, but that was under the Federalist was a loose construction, and under him was strict because he wanted to basically say the Constitution shouldn't have too much power, so it was more strict. Jefferson's advisors. James Madison would be his Secretary of State. James Madison would be very famous. He's already very famous because he, as Secretary of State, he was also the father of the Constitution. He had actually put the Constitution. James Madison was a genius, a complete genius, When I look at James Madison and even what he wrote and everything. Well, here's his wife, Dolly Madison. We're going to find out about her. She becomes a hero in the War of 1812, but we'll go into that later. So James Madison here, and on to Albert Gallatin. Albert Gallatin was an immigrant from Switzerland here, and he became the Secretary of Treasury. And he actually was similar to Alexander Hamilton in putting the money situation together. But although Jefferson did not want the government to have too much money, and he really didn't like the banking system, right? As we said. So, Jeffersonian customs. So, they had a totally different way in the White House, right? Jefferson was laid back, and he was simple, and he liked informal gatherings. So he didn't like everything to be formally, you had to dress up and such, or here's a picture of it more informal in the White House. And he replaced these formal state receptions, and he said, we're going to be seated not by rank. They used to seat everyone as rank, the most important. He said, but first come, first served to see the president, and we'll seat randomly. So we're not going to go by rank anymore. And he abandoned the custom of delivering message to the Congress in person. So before, of course, the presidents would get up in Congress and speak, George Washington and Adams and such, get up and speak. But he said, no, I'm not going to speak. I'm just going to write it down and let somebody else, to tell them what I'm thinking. There was another thing about Thomas Jefferson, though. He wasn't a good speaker, so he'd rather have somebody else speak for him anyway, right? He wrote his messages, and then he'd have someone else read them, right? So another thing about Thomas Jefferson, and this is just a side thought, is that his wife died, even before he went into to be president. So he didn't have his wife there. So his Secretary of State, which was, of course, James Madison's wife, was Dolly Madison. So she actually became the first lady in making sure everything was okay because they didn't have a first lady. Another thing about Thomas Jefferson, that he was raised in the midst of slavery, and Monticello, where he lived and everything, they did have slaves. So, but thing about Thomas Jefferson, and they say, that he had children, with one of the black women that was a slave. Well, come to find out, if you look into it a little bit in depth, Thomas Jefferson was in love with her and was secretly married to her in it. So, I'm not really sure about that whole situation. At that time, you couldn't marry, a white man couldn't marry a black lady. So, there might have been some things going on, above the customs of all this, is that he was married to so-called his black slave, but really it was his friend, and anyway. So let's not get into that whole subject. But he did have children that were half black. Republican office holders. So the Republicans, there was a balanced approach, and because nearly all of the officers at that time before that were Federalists, and so basically Jefferson wanted to get along with the Federalists. So he didn't remove them. He kept both parties there. So he wanted them to be equal and return with joy the state of things. He wanted everyone to get along and not have this rambunctious divided party that they had before with Alexander Hamilton and him. In fact, Alexander Hamilton was supporting Thomas Jefferson. So He wanted to be honest, capable, and faithful to the Constitution. So we have a picture of divided. This is a picture here of George Washington when he was talking to his Secretary of State, which is Thomas Jefferson, and this is Alexander Hamilton, to get along, Federalist and Republican. And this is the woman that Thomas Jefferson loved and really became his common-law wife. Jefferson's new policies. So an effort to cut the government spending in the national debt. So he wanted to cut government spending, which was a problem later on because he would cut our military. And so when we had to go to war, we didn't have a military that was strong because they had no money for the military. So he wanted to cut the spending. He wanted to reduce the number of federal employees. So not have so many federal people working, so we had to pay them. And he wanted to cut the military and the naval expenditures. That would be a bad deal for the War of 1812, right? He'd cut them so we wouldn't have them when the British invaded us. So he wanted to replace that Naturalization Act of 1798 and restore it to 5-year residence for citizenship. You know, take away what Adams put. And he just allowed the Sedition and Alien Act to totally expire. He hated this. Remember the Sedition Act and the Alien Act? He just let it expire, you know, when they were prosecuting those that were speaking against the government, you know. And so then he even repealed taxes on the whiskey tax and said, we don't want these taxes. So he was taking care of that too, getting rid of a lot of taxes. But he did leave Alexander Hamilton's overall plan intact, including the National Bank. He realized he really needed a bank, right? So, and he really looked then at Alexander Hamilton as a financial genius. So he established the military academy at West Point on the Hudson River, which is unlike him because he was reducing military expenses, but he did go ahead and establish an academy. These were under Jefferson. So it says he pardoned many under the Sedition Act, you know, these people that were said to be traitors or treasoners that were not, you know, and he persuaded Congress to repeal the excise taxes. Yeah, we went all and reduce the national debt. The Supreme Court. The Federalists retained control still, especially of the Supreme Court. Remember those last judges, the midnight judges that John Adams put in? So John Adams put in those midnight judges, and John Marshall was Chief Justice, and he was appointed by President John Adams, right? He was a Federalist. And so he would set the precedents for the federal justice system. And they would have what was called a case come through called Marbury versus Madison. So Jefferson took office and Adams' midnight judges had to take office, right? 2. And so Jefferson right away ordered their commissions to be withheld. We don't want those judges. We don't want to pay those midnight judges that he brought in. And so he deprived some of them of office. They hadn't taken office yet. So William Marbury was one of the Supreme Court midnight judges, and he had his job taken away. So he's mad. How dare he take my job away, right? So he went to order the Secretary of State, who is James Madison, to deliver his commission, saying, no, you can't take my job away, and you need to pay me. You know, you have no right in the Constitution to take my job away. So deliver my commission. So this put the Supreme Court in a perplexing situation. Is the Supreme Court able to say that a law is unconstitutional or not? So this might provoke some confrontation between the executive branch and the judicial branch, the judges and the president. Marbury versus Madison was really Marbury versus Thomas Jefferson, right? But he knew that he had to stand up for his rights. How dare they take my job away and not pay me? So Marshall, who was the Chief Justice then, he had an unexpected decision to make. And he made a decision that was now it's called judicial review. And now it's like we know about it all the time. Well, Marlborough was entitled to this commission, right? But the Supreme Court couldn't help him, right? Because it was based on, an unconstitutional act, a judicial act of 1789. So they put it as an act in 1789, but it was very unconstitutional, saying that he couldn't take his job. So this was the first time an act was declared unconstitutional. Never before they had an act saying, no, this is no good. It's unconstitutional. This would forfeit putting more Federalist judges in power. So if they said that this was unconstitutional, then they couldn't go ahead and bring in more of these Federalist judges, right? So Marshall was very ingenious, and he said, given the Federalist Supreme Court untold authority as watching over the Republican legislation. So basically he said, we can't give untold authority, as doing this whole thing, these midnight judges and everything. So he said to nullify any unconstitutional acts of Congress. So he said that we can say that a law is unconstitutional. Unconstitutional means that it does not follow the Constitution. And this process now that we have still is called judicial review. And it's the act that the Supreme Court and the justices can say that a law should not apply because it is not constitutional. It's a bad law. And this is called judicial review. So this is, it's here it tells exactly, it says, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And Marbury versus Bannon says that basically the judges can call a law unconstitutional. And this is called judicial review. Very important, probably a test question. What is judicial review? It's where the judges can say that a law is not constitutional, does not follow the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. So that's that for that.